Norman G. Baker, inventor, radio pioneer, and con artist, 1882 to 1958. Born on November 27, 1882 in Muscatine, Iowa, Norman Glenwood Baker was the 10th and youngest child of a prosperous family. His mother had once aspired to be a writer, while his father, John, was an accomplished machinist who claimed to have 126 patents to his name. Perhaps it is unsurprising that young Norman had big dreams and a strong desire to achieve renown. Unfortunately for his contemporaries, Baker's path to fame and fortune involved promoting hateful conspiracy theories and hawking fake cancer cures to desperately sick people. With his thick head of white hair, lavender suits, and luxurious purple cars, Baker was one of the best known and even popular figures in America during the 1930s. While Baker's commissioned biography by Alvin Winston has a number of charming anecdotes about his childhood, it is far from clear if any of those stories are rooted in fact. Never into formal academic study, Baker dropped out of high school during his sophomore year and began to work at his father's machine shop. He shared much of his father's mechanical inclination, but not his steadiness or work ethic. After learning enough to forge for himself, Baker began to wander from town to town through Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, earning his keep at machine shops as he traveled. After a couple years of this itinerant existence, Baker discovered and developed a deep passion for vaudeville. He was especially intrigued by magic and mind-reading acts, sensing almost intuitively that the whole thing hinged on playing to the psychology of the crowd. Eschewing an apprenticeship in vaudeville, the enterprising Baker started his own troupe and ended up touring for 10 years. Operating under the business name Charles Welch, he toured far and wide and made a good amount of money. His star performer was Madame Tangley, a role that he had to recast once his original Tangley quit. The second Madame Tangley, Teresa Frances Pender Cusick, divorced her first husband to marry Baker and returned with him to Muscatine, remaining with him through the many twists and turns of his career of graft. Baker was a notorious womanizer and heavy drinker throughout his life, so one has to imagine that his married life was not characterized by domestic bliss. Returning to Muscatine in 1914, Baker used his knowledge of machinery and his experience as a performer to create the calliophone, a more portable version of a calliope organ, which sold very well among circus and other public performers. This invention made Baker a wealthy man in his own right, earning $200,000 one year from calliophone sales, and it also gave him some measure of fame. It was ultimately the success of this invention which allowed Baker to engage in his later, more infamous endeavors. One of his other early efforts was a correspondence art school, which offered to teach people to paint in the comfort of their own homes. By Baker's standards, this venture was almost a failure, netting only $75,000 in 3 years. However, given that Baker by his own admission could not paint at all, it encouraged him to apply his hand and his charismatic presence to other fields where his ignorance was no less pronounced. In 1925, after getting permission from the Muscatine County government, Baker opened up a radio station called KTNT, Know the Naked Truth. At this time, even some of the most hard-nosed Wall Street brokers had the opinion that there was something sacred about radio, and that it should not be sullied by advertising. Baker, much like his inspiration and fellow medical swindler, John R. Brinkley of Kansas, had no such scruples. Obtaining permission for a 500-watt broadcast, Baker in reality constructed a 10,000-watt monstrosity capable of broadcasting across most of the North American continent. The station became very popular, largely because, like Brinkley, Baker featured musical performances by emerging stars. In fact, Brinkley and Baker between them did a great deal not only to popularize and spread radio, but to make country music a mainstream sensation. From the outset, Baker's vaudeville training was on full display as he utilized all of the tricks and tropes of prairie populism to amass a large following. Railing against big city elites, Brinkley postured as a champion of the average man. His first crusade was against those who sought to establish monopolies on the airwaves, and he attempted to organize his fellow independent broadcasters. It was also at this time that he began to gravitate towards health and wellness, as this topic was of immense interest to the public, inspired strong emotional reactions from people, and allowed him to rail against the elites of the medical establishment. Norman Baker hit targets large and small, near and far. He renounced local businesses that might compete with his own ventures, put the local high school principal on blast, and also began his longest and most heated rivalry with the chief editor of the Journal for the American Medical Association, Morris Fishbein. Fishbein called Baker a quack with no medical background, and Baker in turn called Fishbein a Jew who was working to establish the supremacy of a cartel of doctors who wanted to resort to surgery when there were cheaper, safer, and more effective remedies available. Baker, who again had no background in medicine, did not imitate Brinkley by going to Mussolini's Italy to get an ersatz medical degree. Instead, he simply decided to promote and reproduce the cures of others who did have at least some credentials, while also promoting conspiracy theories. One of Baker's crusades was against aluminum ware, which he swore was killing people by causing cancer. He also had a visceral hatred for the head of the company responsible for the product, Andrew Mellon, who was the Secretary of the Treasury at the time. When he was audited by the IRS, Baker told his listeners that this was Mellon resorting to what in today's discourse is sometimes called lawfare. Baker also proposed remedies to some ailments, claiming among other things that appendicitis did not require surgery to remove the appendix, but could be dealt with by rubbing the abdomen in a downward direction with a hot onion poultice. If the appendix were kinked up, this would be enough to straighten it out, or so Baker claimed. During the 1928 election cycle, Baker decided to embrace the candidacy of Herbert Hoover, who might prove to be a valuable ally in Washington. Earlier, he had lambasted Hoover for the supposed chaos on the airwaves, as Hoover at the time was the head of the Federal Radio Commission, FRC. Now, however, Baker praised Hoover for his Midwestern roots, while viciously attacking Democratic nominee Al Smith. Baker's attacks centered around Smith's ties to Tammany Hall and his Catholic faith. These attacks drew a formal protest from the Democratic Party, but the Republicans were later convinced that Baker's tirades helped them immensely in the Midwest. Hoover, in fact, personally thanked Baker for his work and even met with him briefly in 1930. Baker requested that Hoover abolish the FRC and approve of one of the cancer cures that he was promoting at the time, but Hoover politely fobbed him off by promising to think about it. More tangibly, Hoover did assist Baker when he launched a newspaper venture. Perhaps because he had now at least an acquaintance in the White House, if not quite a friend, Baker decided to move on from dubious home remedies for lockjaw and urging his listeners to resist vaccination from pedophilic doctors to the creation of large-scale operations for curing cancer. Charles Ozias ran a cancer clinic in Kansas City, Missouri, and his cures were featured on KTNT, especially in 1929. Baker, far from content with promoting Ozias' ideas, copied them and opened up his own treatment facility in Muscatine called the Baker Institute. He promised to cure even cancer without resort to surgery, radium, or x-rays, all of which he vehemently denounced. Since he was not a licensed physician, Baker had to rely on others to head his clinic, or at least present others as authority figures when the government had questions about the operation. The general manager of the hospital's business side was a barber from Illinois who had won a KTNT letter writing contest. The staff were mostly composed of chiropractors, osteopaths, and MDs who were fresh out of diploma mills. Once in a while, Baker would bring in a big-name attraction, as when he snagged the services of the young, famous, and controversial Harry Hoxsey, a self-proclaimed cancer savant from Illinois. This helped to boost attendance at Baker's clinic and gave the then 29-year-old doctor somewhere to go when he began to run into difficulties back home with the authorities. Hoxsey was Baker's star witness when a supposed posse of thugs arrived at KTNT and attempted to assassinate Baker. Baker claims that one of the men was hired by Morris Fishbein, but could not go through with the deed because he recognized Dr. Hoxsey as the man who had saved one of his relatives. Investigators only found shell casings from Hoxsey's weapon and no evidence of the three alleged assassins. Hoxsey did not stay in Muscatine long, But his own career as a medical swindler still had 3 more decades to play out. He learned much from Baker and proved to be more adept at surviving controversies. Part of the reason for Baker and Hoxie's breakup was Baker's insistence on giving orders to his doctors in regard to even the fine-grained details of treatment. He left many notes instructing his doctors to prescribe certain products he manufactured regardless of the particular complaints of the patient. Baker also implemented a $10 mandatory entrance physical exam, and it was common for that exam to result in a devastating diagnosis requiring an extended stay and more expensive treatments. To be a compassionate man of the people, however, Baker sometimes offered discounts or freebies to radio contest winners. However, enough of his doctors were offended by his high-handedness and the medical ineffectiveness of his treatments that they presented his written instructions to government officials and brought down the wrath of the federal government. Baker was charged with practicing medicine without a license, while Hoxie was hit with practicing on a revoked license. The two began to feud over the hospital's profits, and it was widely believed that the earnings of the hospital were underreported, with Baker smuggling out suitcases full of cash in the trunk of his purple car. To keep his medical reputation alive and well in the absence of a radio operation, Baker began live medical shows. These displays attracted large crowds to Muscatine and featured testimonials about many of the medications that he advocated and produced. At one showing, one of Baker's doctors even performed a successful operation to cure brain cancer by opening up a man's skull, applying an ointment, and sewing him back up. Of course, the man's problem was not brain cancer, and the show immediately attracted a number of refutations from all concerned parties in the medical community. Baker would continue to do these shows from time to time as they played to his strengths as a showman. At this juncture, Baker was under assault from the FRC and from the Iowa state government, both of which wanted to remove him from the airwaves, while also being embroiled in his medical licensure conflict. For most men, that would be enough, but Baker was not most men. He also decided to opine on the issue of meat inspection, and so he declared war on the Department of Agriculture. While this controversy over farm policy and meat inspections might sound minor and parochial, the so-called Cedar County Cow War is arguably the greatest scandal in Baker's scandalous career. Farm inspectors checked cows for tuberculosis, requiring that the affected cows be put down so that their meat and milk wouldn't be circulated and thereby spread illness. However, Baker alleged that this was all a big lie, spread in the interest of the big city meat packers who were secretly receiving the diseased cows at a steep discount. Baker compared the incredulousness of those who believed in vaccinating humans and animals to medieval peasants accepting that the devil was the cause of illness. Inspired by Baker's inflammatory rhetoric, Iowa farmers physically assaulted and drove off inspectors, with Baker being personally present for at least one incident when a veterinarian's car took a beating with the aforementioned veterinarian inside. In the end, Governor Dan Turner was forced to call in the Iowa National Guard to carry out the inspections, and the crisis passed. This episode, more than any other, underlined the need to remove Baker from the airwaves, at least in the eyes of officialdom. 1931 was a low point for Norman Baker. In February, the Iowa Supreme Court upheld the injunction which had closed his clinic the previous year. In June, the FRC revoked Baker's radio license on the grounds that he was behaving immorally and spreading harmful information. So much for his friendship with Herbert Hoover. However, Baker was determined to fight back with all of his might and to find alternative avenues to rake in the income that he had been accustomed to when KTNT and his hospital were in full swing. Naturally enough, Baker accused all of his various detractors of using lies to undermine his business interest. In the meantime, now that his businesses were on hold, Baker began to campaign for the Iowa governorship of 1932. However, 1932 would be no kinder to the former vaudeville performer than 1931. In February, his lawsuit against Morris Fishbein and the AMA failed spectacularly, as the AMA proved that many of Baker's best-known cures were ineffective, and few of his former patients were either still living or willing to say anything kind about his treatment. Now paranoid and sensing potential assassins around every corner, Baker suffered the embarrassment of being found in contempt of court for being caught with a revolver in the courtroom. This public trial diminished Baker's credibility, which never fully recovered. It also stymied his political momentum, as the results of the trials caused him to go to Mexico and conduct his campaign from afar. Despite having a few purple vehicles touring the state on his behalf, Baker received only 5,000 write-in ballots. The most that he could claim is a dubious moral victory, as his old nemesis Dan Turner had lost his bid for re-election. In the summer of 1932, Baker sniffed opportunities and a lack of federal and state authorities in Mexico, so he got into his purple Cadillac with its bulletproof windows and went south. Once again, he was following the lead of John R. Brinkley and setting up a massive border blaster radio station in Mexico, while residing on the Texas side of the border as the de facto mayor of an otherwise insignificant, poverty-ridden town. Brinkley had failed in his bid for the governorship of Kansas in 1930, and then turned to Mexico for a career revitalization. It is not for nothing that Pope Brock, who wrote a book about Brinkley, called Baker his violet shadow. Intriguingly, by this point, the two men had come to despise one another, and frequently used their platforms to denounce one another, despite running almost identical schemes and promoting nearly indistinguishable radical right-wing political positions. After 3 years south of the border, a time during which he continued to make now familiar claims about medical controversies and advocated for the new Chancellor of Germany, Baker judged that the heat in Iowa should have subsided enough for him to return triumphantly and launched a new gubernatorial bid for 1936. Once again, Baker's second candidacy was a direct imitation of Brinkley, who mounted a second gubernatorial run in Kansas. Upon his return to Muscatine, Baker was arrested and spent a night in jail for some of his previous offenses. It would appear that he negotiated this slap on the wrist with the authorities. Naturally, Baker then advertised himself as having suffered for the people. Baker's major campaign themes were issues comfortably within the purview of a state governor and near and dear to the hearts of the average Iowan, such as Baker's hatred of the AMA and his desire to abolish the Federal Radio Commission. He also spoke about constructing a highway system as a job project that might help Iowa through the Great Depression, perhaps the first constructive idea Baker generated since developing the Cleophone. Despite being in Iowa for the campaign, making appearances in person, and being included on the ballot, Baker only managed to finish in 5th place. Yet again, drawing upon the more imaginative John Romulus Brinkley for inspiration, Baker decided to set up a new cancer clinic in Eureka Springs, Arkansas. Arkansas had very low standards and few regulations on such activities. Further, the poor town of Eureka Springs welcomed him with open arms in the hopes that he would bring in patients and stimulate the local economy. He set up his office in a posh resort belonging to a former governor, erecting a bulletproof panel to separate himself and his broadcasting space from the public. The lobby, of course, he painted purple. There were rumors, unsubstantiated but largely accepted by the public, that Baker had a bed with purple covers and that he would have sex with his various mistresses between radio segments. Baker's security setup would never be seriously tested, as the real threat to Baker was his new method of advertising his clinic. He put out 300,000 mailers, and they did indeed bring in patients. It would be 4 years before Baker learned that he had erred fatally. In 1937, he had to weather a widely viewed newsreel called Conquering Cancer, where he was singled out as an example of medical quackery. Despite now being a joke in the eyes of most Americans, Baker was still able to attract enough patients to thrive. However, as the clinic was starting to churn a huge profit, Baker found himself in trouble with the law yet again, this time for mail fraud. An Arkansas jury found him guilty on all counts in 1940, and the judge sentenced him to 4 years in federal prison and levied a $4,000 fine. Baker appealed on the grounds that the jury's verdict was illegitimate because they were all drunk, but this appeal fell on deaf ears. He now found himself serving time in Leavenworth, Kansas, until he was released a bit early in 1943. Moving to Florida, it became apparent that Norman Baker had managed to hang on to a very large percentage of his mostly ill-gotten gains. He purchased a yacht formerly owned by Jay Gould and lived in luxury as a Gatsby-esque figure. After a few years in luxurious retirement, Baker attempted to make a comeback in 1946, applying for a license to open a new clinic in Iowa. However, by this time, state authorities wanted nothing to do with Baker, and his appeals were all rejected. Now in his mid-60s, Norman Baker moved to Miami and continued to live in comfortable obscurity. By 1958, however, Baker's years of heavy drinking had finally caught up with him, and he was suffering from cirrhosis of the liver. Still rejecting all forms of conventional medicine, Baker opted for an alternative medicine health sanitarium in Battle Creek, Michigan. The treatments here were little more effective than those offered by Baker a quarter century earlier, but Baker seemed satisfied with the results. He told his friends that he was feeling better than he had in years, and at this rate he could very well live to be 125. However, this was either an unusually good day, or Baker was simply in denial about his mortality, as he was dead within a few weeks of making this final grandiose claim. He was 75 years old. Baker is often compared with the better-known and more innovative John R. Brinkley, whom he imitated on many occasions. Despite the fact that most of Baker's attempts to replicate Brinkley's accomplishments resulted in him falling short of his model, there were a few regards in which Baker was the greater of the two swindlers. For starters, his Calliophone was genuinely innovative and more impressive than anything that Brinkley ever created. Secondly, despite being less knowledgeable and creative in the arena of medicine, Baker was better at both monetizing his operations and squirreling away money. At no point in his adult life after his early 20s was Norman G. Baker ever a broke boy. In terms of being a con artist, Baker was also more successful, if for no other reason that Brinkley had to invent the schemes and all Baker had to do was simply copy them without any of the creative input. Part of their feud was precisely Brinkley's anger that Baker ripped off his ideas while stealing credit. Baker actually did swindle Brinkley early on in their relationship, when he failed to make good on a promise to pay Brinkley $15,000 for some radio equipment that Brinkley gave to him to start up KTNT. Baker's remains were interred at Greenwood Cemetery in his native Muscatine. Greenwood Cemetery sits astride the Mississippi River, and is, fittingly, in between a Hardee's and a Bitcoin depot. His humble headstone, which he shares with his elder sister Irma, provides visitors with no indication that here lies the King of the Quacks, who once cast a purple haze over his home state and much of the American Midwest.